I look at placement of stories. So I try to have something that I tell, something that I read, something that I tell, something that I read, something that I tell, something that I read.
At first he couldn't believe his ears. Cows that type impossible. Click, clack. Click, clack.
I've done that years before at the elementary school, but what triggered that this time, reading a book called A Whole New Mind by Daniel Pink, and in that he retells the story of someone whose name escapes me right now, who was at a school and did the same thing. Asked kids, how many of you are artists? And he did it grade level by grade level by grade level as he moved around in the course of the day. The first time when he asked it to kindergartners, and hands were up just all around. He asked it to first graders, hands were up, but not as many as kindergarten. And as he moved from classroom to classroom, the higher he got up, the fewer hands shot up, to the point where it was like just a handful. And he said, what is it about education that we drive out the creative fire, the creative spirit of kids? How do we create situations where they are aware of their artistry, they are aware of that creative spirit and how it's important? Uncle Pig, the People's Tailor, the story itself, the tailor is a very old Jewish story. And growing up, I heard a lot about my Uncle Pig. And when I discovered the tailor, the Jewish story, I was like, wait, I could actually blend my Uncle Pig, what I know about him, what I've been told through the years about him, just simply that he was a tailor, that he had this arm that was significantly shorter than the other, that my family didn't, ostracize him the way a lot of families did. I thought I could actually celebrate him as a human being by blending his story with this old story, the tailor. I also, so that's one of the reasons for telling. The other is to depend upon the grade level, to give them some indication of what they might be looking forward to when they study American history. Because a lot of the things I talk about in the story of Uncle Pig, the People's Tailor, are things that would not necessarily have happened at that time period in American history in Alabama. And so I usually will conclude with, you'll learn about that once you get to United States history, why this didn't happen that way.
So my full legal name is Tony Lamair Burks II. I rarely say my middle name, but I'm saying it just for you all. Why do I tell you my name? Because it's important to know that, particularly when you learn and hear that I have relatives with some really strange names. I have a relative whose first name is Square. Square Burks. I kid you not. I have a relative whose first name is Icy. Like being cold, icy, blocks of ice, icy. I have a great grandparent whose name is Sweetie. Legal name, Sweetie. So I'm thankful to be named Tony, because I could have been named Rectangle, Octagon, Sweat, Summer, Creek. I could have had all kinds of names. This is a story about a relative who has a unique name. His name is Pig. I know. That's why I'm thankful to be named Tony. So this is a story of my Uncle Pig, and I call this Uncle Pig, the People's Tailor. Uncle Pig, the People's Tailor. Now let me tell you a little bit. I'm going to need you to help me tell this story at certain parts. And so I'm going to ask you to join in. All right? So my Uncle Pig was born many, many years ago, and there was something unique about him. Not only was his name different, but his body was a little different. You see, My Uncle Pig had one arm that was significantly shorter than the other. So back then in Alabama, if you had an arm that was significantly shorter than the other, or had something that was different about your body, they would put people like my Uncle Pig away, separate them. The beauty is that my family thought, no, we're not going to do that. So they brought my Uncle Pig, made sure he was connected with the family, and they taught him different things. One of the things that they taught my Uncle Pig how to do was to sew. My Uncle Pig became a tailor, and he used a sewing machine that he powered with his foot, and that one arm that was significantly shorter than the other. So you could see my Uncle Pig making clothes, working on that old-fashioned sewing machine. He made clothes for everybody in the community. You know, he started out with the family, but then he began to make clothes for people in the city, began to make clothes for people in the neighboring cities, began to make clothes for important big people, made clothes for people when they were going to balls and weddings, made clothes for people who would show up at important events that included the governor of the state of Alabama. In fact, he made clothes at one point for the governor of the great state of Alabama. The sad thing about my Uncle Pig is that he never took time to make clothes for himself. So I had a relative who said, Pig, you have got to make some stuff for you. And he thought, oh my goodness, I've spent all this time making clothes for all these people, the mayor, the governor, debutantes, all these people. I've not made anything for myself. So guess what? I'm going to spend some time. And he thought, I don't have the time to go out and find fabric, so what can I do? He looked around his shop and he thought, oh, well, I've got some of this fabric from a dress I made. I've got some of this fabric for a pair of pants I made. Oh my goodness, I can use a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of the other, and make something. So what did he do? He took out his scissors, and this is where I need your help. Take out your scissors. Be careful, you don't want to cut anyone. He took out his scissors and he began to cut. He took out his sewing machine. With that arm significantly shorter than the other, he began to stitch. Took out a needle and thread. And then he finished it with a bow. And what did he make? He made this long flowing robe, and he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, oh my goodness, Pig, you have done yourself an amazing thing here. And he put on that long flowing robe. And he wore it in his house and thought, I got to wear this out. So he wore it here. He wore it there. He wore it everywhere. And he wore it 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 until he wore it plumb out. Now, we need to pause for the cause, because you all are in Southern California. You don't know what plumb out means. That's an old Southern saying that when you wear something plumb out, there's nothing else you could do to it. So he had worn this thing to death, plumb out. So he took this long flowing robe, he walked over to his trash, and he was about to toss it, and he thought, wait a minute, I'm Pig, the people's tailor. I've got this. I can make something else. So he takes out his scissors. Can you help me with the scissors? And he began to cut. Sewing machine. Needle and thread. And he finishes it with what? A bow. And he put on his new creation, which was a vest. And it was an amazing vest. And he couldn't wear that vest just in the house. He had to wear it out. I mean, really, Pig, the people's tailor, he'd outdone himself. So he wore it what? Here. He wore it what? There. He wore it everywhere. And he wore it 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 until he wore it what? Plumb out. Not just out. Plumb out. And he looked at that vest, and he'd been to the county fair And he had mustard on it. Right, ew. And he'd hugged 2 babies, and they were, so he had some, maybe it was baby food, maybe it wasn't baby food on his vest. We don't know. So he threw that thing away, and he started on a new dress because he had to have this dress for this party that was coming up. So he was working away, and he thought, wait a minute, I've got just enough material to make something else. So he goes and he takes that vest out, and he decides that he's going to make a bow tie, because I mean, really, what else could you make? So he took out his scissors. You got your scissors, and we're cutting. It's a bow tie, y'all. It didn't take that much. Takes out his sewing machine, needle and thread, finishes off with a what? A bow. He ties, because it's a hand tie bow tie, not those clip-on ones, but hand tie. He ties that bow tie on. He wears it what? Here. He wears it what? There. He wears it everywhere. And he wore it, 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 until he wore it what? Plumb out. Not just out, plumb out. Because that's what you do in Alabama when you're making clothes for the governor of the state of Alabama. Well, my goodness. He looked at that thing, he took it off, threw it away, walked back over, picked it up and said, ah ha ha, I can make something else. I'm going to make a button. Because when you make clothes for the governor of the state of Alabama, you don't make buttons, you make buttons. So he took out his scissors. You got your scissors? Y'all cutting too much. Sewing machine. Needle and thread. Finished off with a what? Bow. And he wore it here. He wore it there. He wore it everywhere. And he wore it, 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 until he wore it what? Plumb out. Because that's what you do. And he looked at that button and he thought, oh my goodness, as tattered and torn as it is, I can make something else. I can make something else. I can make it into a story. And he took that story and he told it here, he told it there, he told it everywhere. And he told it to my great-grandfather, who told it to my grandfather, who told it to my daddy, who told it to my mama, who told it to me. I'm telling it to you. And because it's a story, it can never, ever, ever be worn what? Plumb out. Uncle Pig, the People's Tailor.